Thanks very much for the invite. Happy to talk today about multimodal speech understanding. So as Lynn said, I'm from the School of Engineering in Trinity College, Dublin, and my area of research is human speech communication. So to get straight into it, today I'm going to talk a little bit, remind ourselves why a multimodal view of speech is really vital. I'm going to focus in this short talk just on two core aspects of speech, which when you consider them, can change the deep learning architecture that you use. And I'm going to use examples from my own group's research in audiovisual speech recognition and multimodal turn-taking prediction to illustrate the ideas. So if you look at the performance of speech recognition today, well, the group here in, let me turn on my laser pointer. So the group here in Microsoft compared human transcription up here versus their latest deep learning models. Now, the details aren't too important, but they carried out this experiment on the NIST 2000 corpus, so the switchboard and call home partitions. If people are familiar with them, it's beneficial. It doesn't really matter. The switchboard task is slightly easier. Call home is conversational, looser speech, if you like. Humans can get a word error rate of just under 6% on one partition and over 11% in the other. They put together their best DNN architectures and pretty much achieved parity with the human transcribers. So, you can say we can all go home. Speech recognition is a solved task, but not really. If you work in the area, you realize that noise really changes that. So if anyone's familiar with the chime task, it's been running a few years now, where you have people in far more realistic environments, like these 4 people talking at home. There's a microphone array in the corner here, which is this device. And they put this data out to the community, again, in a shared task where everybody tried to see what they could do with this data. So those 2 tracks here, again, the details aren't important. I'm just trying to illustrate performance levels. So the task where everybody could try their absolute utmost was where there was an unconstrained language model. This is the evaluation. This is word error rate. So lower is better. This is the baseline, and the best group was this group, which they still had over 30% word error rate in realistic conditions. So, that's not really useful. And that's an audio only treatment of speech recognition. So the limitations. Noise, when we speak in normal situations, everything overlaps. You have lots of non-native speakers. If you ever get speech recognition to work for a child or an elderly person, you know that that's problematic. So anywhere basically that you have an atypical speaker, you're going to have problems with speech technology. And that's not only for automatic speech recognition. So that brings us to multimodality. It's interesting actually to go back to when people were exploring more about human perception of speech. So in the 70s, this is a well-respected paper at the time, and you can argue that it was a multimodal treatment in terms that they were talking about there is a general agreement that any satisfactory account of speech perception must include at least auditory, phonetic, phonological, syntactic, and semantic levels. But there's no mention of the visual. So it's only really in the mid-70s that people started to really consider what the visual modality could do for us in speech. So there was work here from Bini et al., where they started to explore how this visual side can give you the place for articulation, or Dodd's work, where they looked at how the visual side can help with perception in white noise. And that led us to, 76, where the McGurk effect came on board. Now, if you don't know what the McGurk effect is, do go look at that video. But this is where McGurk and John McDonald discovered that when they changed the video feed with an auditory feed, so if you have audio of somebody saying ba, 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 and you mix that with a video where someone seems to have the mouth movements of fa, even though the audio hasn't changed, people will perceive fa. So the visual side of perception is actually really, really important for speech. And that can help us most in low SNRs. It can help with more than just speech understanding in terms of speech decoding of words. It can help with localization, telling who in a room is speaking. We as humans can deal with a lot of asynchrony in speech, and it can help us with distant speech as well. So, you know, the visual side has a lot to offer, but, you know, speech recognition in itself is maybe quite a narrow viewpoint. If you think of a less controlled human conversation, you know, there's everything from the words we use, there's how we say them, the intonation we use head gestures, nods, eye gaze, the back channels, like when we say when we're signaling that we understand and someone can keep going. You know, we have an amazing ability as humans to effortlessly combine all these cues to understand speech. So, you know, if the nonverbal aspects of interaction are so important, it really is crucial that if we're developing speech technology, that we can take that into account if we really want to develop robust systems, okay? So in the time I've left, I just want to concentrate on two aspects. So in speech, how can we exploit the fact that the visual and audio modalities have a natural asynchrony where there's different times where we should be learning from one signal or the other? And also the fact that different modalities, those cues can be changing at different rates, okay? So the first one I'm going to discuss briefly is audiovisual speech recognition. So this idea of using the visual side of speech, so lip reading effectively to augment speech recognition. You know, early work in AVSR, as we call it, very much separated out the audio and the video signal. For the visual side, you were trying to extract some, you know, region of interest, as they call it, an area around the mouth, and learn visual features from that, classically active appearance models or DCT, and then somehow fuse those into an acoustic model. You know, and the tasks were quite simple at that stage. So things have moved on with deep learning architectures, and some of the work I'll show, the data set that we've evaluated those on, you'll see most AVSR work at the moment uses LRS2, which is a large data set from the BBC with many, many hours of data, very challenging head poses, changing illumination, poor resolution, all the problems that you need to be able to cope with. So we looked at lip reading tasks. Let's look at the visual side. So from a lip reading point of view, what can I learn from speech? And, you know, what unit should I be using? Well, if you just put together a simple CNN front end with an LSTM and, you know, say, well, what can I predict from the visual side of speech? Can I lip read visemes, which are the visual equivalent of phonemes? Can I predict actual phonemes, or can I, in the way that we would for automatic speech recognition now, can I actually predict characters? And this is accuracy, so higher is better. I'm quite good at predicting visemes. Don't worry too much about the different models. These are all similar versions. But I'm not very good at predicting phonemes or characters from the visual side. And if we go over to the audio only side, if we just use a standard MEL spectral sort of front end with an LSTM, we can predict whatever we like. The audio is the dominant signal here and is very rich in that we can predict visemes, phonemes, or characters all very, very well. So we came at this with the idea that we need to understand that the visual modality in speech is not equal. It plays a complementary role to the audio that ebbs and flows, and we need to teach that to a neural network. This comes from the observation that visemes linguistically are not all that useful. So when we were looking at other architectures around at the time when we did this work, they were very much encoding each modality separately, and representations would be fused at the decoding stage. Whereas we take the approach that the acoustic representation we use of speech gets altered by the visual representation in a multimodal encoding process. So before the decoding actually starts. And in essence, our system, what it sees influences what it hears. Now, again, race through this. I can't really go into too much detail. This work was published. I'm happy to take it up offline with anyone, but we have a separate audio encoder and video encoder here. And we attend, the top layer attends to the output of the top layer of our audio encoder, should I say, attends to our video encoder. So we have a cross-modal alignment here, and we've come up with an audio-visual representation. So our audio is influenced by what we see in essence. And then this audio-visual representation is fed to our decoder. And then we have a second input-output alignment through our second attention mechanism here. Contrast that sort of approach with the classic approach where you have, this is the team from Oxford, the DeepMind people collaborate with them, where they have a separate, again, audio and visual encoder, but they keep everything separate at the encoder stage, and only in the decoder do you bring things together. So you have your attention mechanism here. So how does this work? Well, we've set up a evaluation on LRS2, very standard audio front end. The visual front end takes regions of interest around the speaker's mouth. We train with gradually noisier speech, and all our code for all this work is open sourced if anybody is interested. So we re-implemented the system from the Oxford guys, but without using the large language models for pre-training that they use. So we call it AV-CAT instead of watch, listen, attend, spell, WLAS, which they call it. So what we're looking at here is clean speech, gradually more noisy speech going to the right. Character error rate is the performance, so lower is better. So you can see as our audio in blue gets noisier, obviously the performance falls apart. But when you add the audio visual, so when you add the visual side to things, so the best system that we have is this striped bar here. It doesn't fall apart as much, which in audio-visual speech recognition is actually, with state of the art, as much as you can hope for. So we recover some of the performance, and we do that more effectively than the watch, listen, attend, spell system in green. I can't get into the action unit loss. That's a little bit too esoteric for this talk, but just to show that in the system, this is a representation of the video lead in our system. So the cross-modal attention here, and this is a visual representation of how the timing between the audio visual is changing. And this is a sentence starting with the compost. So we have plosive sounds like the t here and the p here and the t at the end. And these are the regions where we're getting the greatest video lead. So that gives you an idea of how we're learning to exploit the asynchrony in the audio-visual signal for speech recognition. The other quick aspect that I want to get into is neural turn-taking prediction. So, I talked about the richness of human interaction. Turn-taking is somewhere where that is very, very important. Turns happen super fast in human speech. This is two speakers in the MATTAS data set speaking. So this is, A's speech and B's. You can see that there's a lot of overlap. The turn switches are very, very short, whereas a pause in one speaker's speech can actually be much longer than the actual gap between turns. So those gaps actually for human speech, if you measure it from a large data set, tend on average to be around 200 milliseconds. So we've already planned what we're about to say before we start speaking and before the other person has finished their turn. So in dialogue systems, this idea of, waiting for a pause and equating that to a turn switch is not useful, not for real systems. Humans interpret linguistic, speech, visual cues, all these modalities in parallel. And they can have an additive effect in our ability to predict when someone is going to yield their turn, when people want to hold on to their turn, or when we signal that we want to take an initial turn in a conversation. Now, some of the first work, again, whistle-stop tour, but some of the first work on continuous turn-taking prediction came from Gabriel Scantz in KTH, where he would have put together an LSTM model which took speech and predicted continuously whether a person would still be speaking within an upcoming window. So he would have used acoustic and part of speech features for that, but we extended that work looking at a very wide range of acoustic and linguistic features. Again, the details are not what I'm trying to get into here, it's more the concept. So when we used a very large array of acoustic, linguistic, and phonetic features for that sort of task, what we found was when we looked at the features that were contributing, so this is a representation of what features had the most effect on reducing our loss in our model. And they're all audio features, you know, loudness, MFCCs, pitch, etc., which didn't really agree with what we were reading in the literature, that linguistic features should help more. That's well understood. So that led us to think that the LSTM type architecture wasn't really the best way to temporarily model linguistic features. Because again, if you think of speech and you think of turns, you know, there's hierarchical structure of language during a speaking turn. You know, the phonemes create the words create the interposal units, and the interposal units then create turns. But these are getting slower and slower as we go along. And in terms of an LSTM model, that's quite tricky if you've just got a 50 millisecond frame for everything. So that led us to put together a multi-scale RNN architecture where different modalities can get modeled in separate LSTM subnetworks and can have independent timescales. Now, we have an ACL paper on this where we've assessed the, you know, both linguistic with acoustic and visual with acoustic cues. And unfortunately, we can never find a data set that allowed us to do all three, but this is the general idea where maybe this is the acoustic LSTM, you can see that at a high data rate, whereas the linguistic LSTM is very more, you know, we're sampling that more slowly. And then this is our master LSTM that checks in with these different layers in our multi-scale architecture at different times. So again, not going to get into too much detail on it, but the features are at different rates, 10, 50 milliseconds, and we use gaze features from OpenFace along with confidence scores. And I don't have time to get into it. Happy to take it up with anyone, but it does work. We find that slower rates are better for linguistic features, and the multi-scale architectures do work, and you do need the features at different rates for this to work. And equally, again, the visual features we found matter more on different turns. And again, the different rates of performance were important. So just to finish up, the take home from this very short talk, sorry it was so brief, but you know, speech really is multimodal, and you have to consider how the different modalities for speech interplay, because that's always going to lead you towards a neural architecture that's more suitable for what you're trying to model. You know, data, putting more data into it is not always going to save you. And if you really understand the signal that you're dealing with, you may find you can learn from less data. So that's me. That's my talk finished. Just thank members of my group for all their help. And thank you.